My name's Kay Brown, and I teach English here, and along with Tanya Northerner and I, we do the Common Reading Program, and we're pretty excited to have our guest speaker here today, and I'm going to introduce her, but just for a second, I know you guys are really good, but make sure your phones are muted. If you're not familiar with the building, if you need to use the restroom, you go out the back door and turn left, and also try to grab a hold of those doors when you go because they crash like, you know, big time. So I'm going to introduce our guest speaker. So Heather Henson is the author of several award-winning picture books and novels for young readers, including That Book Woman, Lift Your Light a Little Higher, Dream of Night, The Whole Sky, Here's How I See It, Here's How It Is, and most recently, Wrecked, a contemporary reimagining of Shakespeare's The Tempest set in Kentucky against the backdrop of the opioid crisis. For many years, she was an editor of children's books at HarperCollins Publishers in New York City. Returning to her home state to write and raise her family, Heather is also managing director of Pioneer Playhouse, Kentucky's oldest outdoor theater located in Danville, and founded by her father, Eben Henson, in 1950. And we have some brochures about the Playhouse. We're laughingly saying we're going on a field trip this summer, so if anybody's interested in visiting the Playhouse in Danville, let me know. So, but without any further ado, Heather Henson.
Well, I want to say, and if I talk too loud, let me know too. I want to say thank you to Kay and Tanya for inviting me to be here. And, I don't think I'd ever been to Owensboro. I know you should have a memory of if you've been somewhere, but I actually am not sure, maybe when I was a kid. And, it's a great place, a beautiful campus. I'm really loving it here. I love that you've been doing the Owensboro Common Reading for 20 years. That's pretty remarkable. I mean, that's pretty remarkable. And I have some great people that I've come after. I can't believe you had Ada Liman last year. Wow, she's like amazing. And I'm so glad she's done so incredibly well, so well deserved. I went to school with this guy, Frank X. Walker, and I think Morris Manning was here a few years ago, and we grew up together. So, but it's very flat here in this part of Kentucky. Like, I'm used to rolling hills and like the knobs that I talk about, in my book. So yeah, I'm going to do a talk. I think some of you said like, oh, you're reading. I'm not going to read. I want to talk about the book and my inspiration and my writing process. And so we'll just start and tell you a little bit about my background. We are such stuff as dreams are made on, and our little life is rounded by a sleep. I love Shakespeare, always have. My father would quote Shakespeare to me all the time, especially lines from The Tempest, because The Tempest has beautiful, beautiful lines. I think, the reason that my dad, that's not typical for a dad to be quoting Shakespeare, but I grew up in the theater. My dad started Pioneer Playhouse in 1950. It is Kentucky's oldest outdoor theater. We got people started there like John Travolta and Lee Majors and Jim Varney back in the 50s and 60s. We'll be celebrating 75 years this summer. And this is what the outdoor theater looks like. It's outdoor, under the stars, crickets, cicadas, planes sometimes going overhead. But it's kind of the beauty of outdoor theater, and it's very much like Shakespearean in the day to be outside. And there's a company bowing at the end of a show. We bring our company, it's a professional theater. We're non-equity, but professional. We bring actors from all over the country, and they come and they live in this small town of Danville for the whole summer. And so that was my childhood, is growing up in a small town, Danville, but always having this kind of crazy, magical theater. Nobody else I knew had a theater and had a costume room and a dad that put on plays. And so, I feel incredibly fortunate, and that's me and my mom. I definitely grew up on stage and behind the scenes and thinking that I would be an actress. And I was really lucky because my parents always told me, follow your dream, do what you love doing. This is me when I'm 11 on stage doing a play. So I definitely thought that. But in college, I started being drawn more and more to writing. It was something I also loved a lot. And in college, I realized, I didn't want to act anymore. I wanted to create the stories. And so that's what I started doing. And I started being more drawn to fiction than playwriting or screenwriting. I've written 9 books, picture books for young readers, middle grade novels, and young adult novels. And this was a middle grade novel I wrote several years ago called Here's How I See It, Here's How It Is. And it's about a little girl growing up in a theater in the middle of Kentucky. And it's not a memoir. I do not write nonfiction. I often say to people, I could not write nonfiction if I tried. I really always have to do fiction. But a part of this book was about a theater company that is doing Shakespeare. And so one of the plays that was really important in this book was The Tempest. And this is my ratty old copied copy of The Tempest that I would use and I would go back to. But in that book, The Tempest was really thematically important. And the theater did that show. The young character, Junebug, who's the main character, was too young to be the plum role of Miranda. Her older sister, her beautiful older sister gets to be that. And she has to be the sound effect. So like she's the one backstage, like in the theater in the old days, and still today, you can have a sheet of a metal and you hit it, and that's the sound effect for thunder. And so in my story, she does that, but she's not Miranda. But from that book on, The Tempest was kind of like a seed that was planted and kept kind of growing and sprouting. And I kept writing in my journals how I really wanted to take the framework of a young girl and her father who have been shipwrecked on a deserted island and kind of take that and do something new with it. At the start of The Tempest, we learned that Miranda has been shipwrecked with her dad 13 years before when she was really little. They've never seen other human beings. And he was shipwrecked because of some double cross he did in his past life, which you don't really know. It's kind of mysterious circumstances. So The Tempest is about revenge, but it's also about first love, sacrifice, redemption, rebirth. When I first thought about retelling The Tempest, I just kept having this, like, I need to do this story, but I don't know how I'm going to do it. And I'd make several starts. But when I first thought I would try to do fantasy, I talked to somebody out there who loves reading fantasy, but I just am not a fantasy writer. Like, it just wasn't working. And then next I tried to do post-apocalyptic because I felt like the whole father and daughter on a deserted island kind of fit in with this no other humans around. It would be a post-apocalyptic world. I would try to pitch that to my editor, and she would be like, there's just too many post-apocalyptic novels out there. Like, they're just going to get lost. So I kind of gave that up. And what I came back to is that I am a Kentucky writer. And all of my books have been set in Kentucky and have been about Kentucky. I lived in New York City for 17 years, but I always wrote about Kentucky. And then I returned about 20 years ago. And so place is really important to me. So I started thinking about where I could place my story in Kentucky that would feel isolated. It would feel like a deserted island where you could get away, you could hide, you could be away from people if you wanted to. And I came up with the Knobs. And the Knobs are near me. The region goes kind of far, but there's some knobs near Danville, Kentucky. So I was really familiar with how, it's so isolated. You can really isolate yourself there. And it's not Appalachia. It's not that high as Appalachia, but it's still a place that you can get lost. And, you know, a lot of people, when they talk about my work, reviews, or just people in general, will say that they feel like place is almost a character in the story. And that's definitely the way I feel. I feel like place is very important to me. So I started gathering photos like these to kind of, I mean, I went to the Knobs, I would spend time there, but also just kind of as a writer, I gather photographs and I put them up on a board, kind of mood board, you know, to get into and the characters and to think about the characters. So I spent time doing that. And once I started thinking about setting The Tempest, which is my favorite Shakespeare play, in contemporary rural Kentucky, I started wondering what would be the equivalent of the magic that Prospero develops in the play. So in the play, Prospero, once he's been on this deserted island, he starts developing these magic powers. He's kind of like a wizard, a magician, and he starts developing that. So I started wondering what would be the modern equivalent of that. And it took me a long time, but suddenly it hit me one day that it would be meth, that Poe, who I renamed Prospero Poe, would be a wizard and he would be a cooker of meth. And I actually called my editor with that idea. And, you know, she had not liked the fantasy, she had not liked the post-apocalyptic, but she was like, yeah, like we kind of jokingly at the time, and I don't mean to be flippant, we called it the Meth Tempest. And it was like, yes, that's like perfect, that's perfect. But why? Why meth? It was because at the time that I was starting to gather all my research and really think about it, there were articles in the newspaper every day about houses being raided, about kids being taken from their homes, about meth houses exploding. And it was literally in our local paper every day. And so I started thinking about, you know, that would be the kind of magic that this father had developed over time. And meth was on the rise at that time, and I think probably a lot of you all know, because it's an incredibly easy drug to create yourself. You know, it was a time, it was kind of at the end of the oxy thing. No one could get oxy anymore, but meth is something you can make from stuff around the house, and you can make it very easily. So it was having a huge resurgence. And I started talking to people who were going through it, and I started hearing a lot of stories. And I know from talking to some of you today, there are a lot of stories, you know, out there. Meth, oxy. I don't think addiction has touched everyone now. There's no one who's left untouched by meth. And so that was another thing I really felt like this would be a relevant way to retell Shakespeare, to think about it in a new way. And I thought it would be really relevant. So Brecht isn't a word by word, scene by scene retelling of Shakespeare. It kind of was more of a jumping off point. And in all honesty, I think who said that they didn't tell their students at first that it was Shakespeare? Because, you know, people are afraid of Shakespeare. They're afraid of it. It kind of seems boring, it's dusty. And even my editor was kind of like, you know, this is a coming of age story about kids growing up in Kentucky, dealing with addiction. You don't have to really mention the Tempest thing. But for me, the Tempest came first, and it was very important to me. So I really stayed with that. So place was really important, but also I'm a very character-driven writer. I will have an idea for a story. I feel like I know kind of where I'm going, but until characters actually start speaking to me, I don't, nothing really moves, nothing really happens. I knew from the beginning that I wanted to make Miranda, who became Mary in my story, who is a teenage girl stranded on a deserted island. I wanted to make her the main character. In The Tempest, you know, she's kind of a side character. Prospero, the dad, is the main character. But I wanted to take her story. I wanted to take her, hey, I've been raised by my dad. He lied to me about why we're here. He hasn't told me the whole truth. So I wanted to make her front and center. And I wanted the epic love story because there's it's a love story in The Tempest for those of you who don't know. And it's like love at first sight. They see each other and it's like that Shakespearean love at first sight. Because one of the things is it's the first boy Miranda has ever seen, like in her whole life. Like the only other guy she's ever seen is her dad in the 13 years she's been on the island. So it's like, wow, guy here. And so love at first sight. And then for Ferdinand, he's seen women, he's been out in the world, but like she's pretty like, wow, like she came out of the woods and she almost seems like a fairy or an apparition. So, there's definite love at first sight. And so that was my first thing is like, I'm doing this love at first sight. So Miranda became Miri, Ferdinand became Fen. I started out in the first person Miri, and I really thought I was going to tell the story first person her. But I kept hearing Fen's voice in my ear. I kept hearing him talking. And Fen, and that's what happens to me. Characters start talking. They just start kind of talking in my head and they start doing things I don't expect them to do. So for a while I was going back and forth between Fen and Miri in first person. But something was missing. Like I couldn't figure it out what was missing, but something was missing. And in The Tempest, Caliban is a character that now has been studied a lot through the ages. In the play, he's the only living native of the island. His mother has been killed by Prospero, supposedly because she was an evil witch, and he had to get rid of her, and he took over her powers. Caliban is portrayed by Shakespeare as a savage who tried to rape Miranda. But of course, modern readers have found him a more sympathetic character. What choice did he have? His island was invaded. His mother was murdered. Like, why wouldn't he be angry? Why wouldn't he have a reason to kind of lash out? So Caliban, in my book, became Clay, someone who protects Miri and who secretly loves her. Someone who's native of the land, came from the knobs, and is more comfortable in the natural world and distrusts kind of the human world. And again, the Tempest was a jumping off point. I didn't follow scene by scene, word by word. It was just kind of a jumping off. But the tropes, the themes were very important to me to kind of keep. And the main one is the thunder crash. The idea of thunder and lightning and always an impending storm. And in the book, we open with some kind of storm. It's not a real storm. It's the storm of Poe, being angry with his daughter, and things are just and he's also always worried. He's paranoid about what's going to happen. So there's always this rumbling storm about what's going to happen. Whoops, there it goes again. And we go to the next one. And so throughout the book, storms are a major motif, both emotionally and physically. It's how a lot of characters feel, and they feel wrecked. And so the title came out of the characters feeling emotionally and physically drained and wrecked. But storms was a huge thing for me to carry throughout the novel. Creating Miri, I started collecting images. That's my main thing. I put images up on a board, and I just start, kind of having a mood board. And I wanted her to be tough and strong because as a writer, I love creating tough and strong women. They have weaknesses, they have, flaws, but they can hold their own. They're kick-ass. I want them to be really tough. I grew up in a time where TV was just starting to have kind of powerful women like Charlie's Angels and The Bionic Woman. And I used to just eat those up, you know. And so as a writer, I've always wanted to create really, really strong female characters. Buffy the Vampire Slayer was one of my favorites, like in my 20s. I was 20s and 30s, but I still love Buffy. So Miri was feeling pretty easy to write. Like she was kind of coming together. She had a lot of interests and ability. She's a welder. She rode motorcycles. Like she was just coming, you know, that was fine. Fen was not happening so easily for me. I was kind of feeling like he was a one-dimensional character. He was there for a reason, for the first love, for the love at first sight thing. He definitely, you know, he was the city boy, fish out of water, but he was feeling kind of boring, and I couldn't figure out why. And suddenly, or not suddenly, but in the first draft, the soundscape thing happened. You know, this is kind of the weird thing about a writer. It's like you don't really know, you know, what's going to work. And as a writer, you also steal from people, you know. So I have a friend who does installations. She's an artist. And she incorporates sound, you know, in her installations. And so I had that in the back of my head. And so the first draft, you know, I kind of had Fen talk about how a friend of his made beats. And that morphed into the friend made soundscapes. And then suddenly in another draft, it was like, oh, Fen needs to make soundscapes. Like that is going to make him kind of a real character. There's some sound on this one too. That's some art exhibits with the soundscapes. So, you know, that was kind of a revelation because it not only sound became his thing, Fen's thing, it became an integral part of the story because through sound, we learn a lot about Kentucky, we learn a lot about the environment, but it also, Fen's recording of Miri becomes really important. And then a recording she makes secretly for Fen, you know, becomes kind of a turning point in the story. So, you know, again, Soundscape started as a way to make Fen's character more interesting, but it really morphed. And I didn't plan that. I mean, that's the beauty of writing, at least for me, is that I don't always know where I'm going. I'm not a writer who does an outline and really knows this is what I'm going to do. I actually wish I was I wish I was a writer who did outlines, but I don't. I kind of let things happen, and characters are very important. So, you know, it just kind of was perfect. The soundscape thing became like a perfect thing for the whole thing. Oh, let me go back to Clay. Diving deeper into Clay, people always ask writers, what are your favorite book? What's your favorite book that you've written? What's your favorite character that you've written? And a lot of times writers will say, oh, we don't have a favorite. Because writers are kind of like moms. Like we're not supposed to say that we have a favorite. But I'm going to tell you that Clay is my favorite. He's my favorite character that I've ever written. I felt like Clay kept creating himself. And I know that sounds weird for those of you who maybe don't write. But as I've said, as I keep emphasizing, you know, characters just speak to me and they kind of go in a direction I don't really understand. And Clay kept surprising me. He kept disappointing me. He kept breaking my heart. But he just, you know, he just kept doing what Clay was going to do. And I love him. He's my favorite character. He's noble, you know, he's of the land. Yeah, I just love Clay. And there was a version where things don't turn out so well. I mean, they don't turn out well for Clay, but it was going to be even darker. And, you know, I kind of felt like I had to bring Clay in and have some redemption at the end and be okay as much as he can. How long does it take to write a book? The time totally varies. I'm a little unusual because I write picture books, middle grade novels, young adult novels. A lot of children's book authors only focus on YA or middle grade or picture books, but I do the whole gamut. And I think it was because I was an editor at HarperCollins working on children's books, and I worked on all of them. So I really gained a love of the picture books, middle grade and young adults. And people always ask me, what's hardest? What's hardest to write? A picture book or a novel? And I will always say a picture book. Because, with a novel, you can just go on and on and on. You can just keep going. With a picture book, you have 32 pages to tell a story. You have a very short amount of time. Every word counts. So writing picture books is a lot like writing poetry. And it really has to, tell a story in a very short amount of time. Though I have to say, after working on Wrecked, I feel like I also want my novels, every word matters. I wanted Wrecked to be not too long. I wanted the chapters to be short. I wanted the writing to be spare and give the feeling of moving fast. And I feel like I achieved that, but I love that now. And I think, for my next book and I'm going to, work on that and see about making, a few words matter. So I feel like that's my new style and my new voice that I really want to keep with. But if you count the time that I started thinking about writing this book and thought about the Tempest framework, Wrecked really took 15 years. So it's a long time, writing. And when I come to younger classes, when I talk to students, like they're just like, that's my whole life. Like, what are you talking about? It takes 15 years to write a book. But the time when I actually knew I was going to do the Meth Tempest and focus on that time took about 2 years. And then once I sent it to my editor, it took about 2 more years for revisions and editing. So it's a long process. Writing is a long process. So finally, and you do many drafts. I love this photograph. This is a friend of mine, Laura Geringer. This is a book she wrote, a middle grade novel. These are the drafts. This is the stack of drafts that it took to get to this novel. And so what I love to tell writers and wannabe writers and students is your first draft is never perfect. Your second draft is never perfect. Maybe your 5th draft is not perfect. I mean, every writer is different, but I go through many, many, many drafts before I even send it to my editor. And then once my editor in New York, her name is Caitlin Bluey. She's a fantastic editor. She actually has her own imprint now, Caitlin Bluey Books at Simon & Schuster. And, I go back and forth with her for many, many drafts. I'm lucky I have a relationship with an editor. I've had the same editor for 10 years, but she is tough, man. I mean, she makes me work so hard. Like, I sometimes call her my torturer because really I feel tortured. I mean, she'll leave me in tears. I'll think I'll have sent this great draft to her and I get a letter back, I have gotten a 25-page editorial level, single spaced, from my editor. So, it's a lot of work. And I think a lot of people, they can't imagine, handing their work over and being edited. And maybe because I was an editor for a long time, I really understand the importance of that. I feel like writers can sometimes fall in love with their own words. And think that everything is great and working really well. And you need someone from the outside to look at it and say, this scene isn't working, this character isn't working, it needs more. Just like Fen, actually, once I had gotten to the drafts to send Caitlin, it was like, Fen is still not working, you need to work some more. So I truly believe, that other people can come in and help you and work with you on that. And one of the things that, I went to the New School in New York City, creative writing degree, and a lot of my teachers would always say, if you love a sentence, if you think that sentence is the best sentence you've ever written, cut it. because probably it's not. Probably you've kind of become, fallen in love with it, but it's not the best way to keep the book moving or whatever. So finally, Rec came out. Woohoo! Yay! So you work for all this time. As a writer, you have to really love to be alone, because most of your time is spent alone. Most of your time is sitting at a desk day after day, trying to create characters, trying to create a story, trying to finish. The start when you're writing is awesome. Like, you start a book, you have this idea, you're like, whoa, I'm starting, this is so great. The middle is hard. The middle is hard to keep going and getting that first draft. And then the end is fun too. It's like, yay, I'm coming to the end. Yay, yay, yay. But so Wrecked was published hardcover in 2022. And then it came out a year later in paperback. And, what is cool is that you do spend so much time alone, but then you do get to come out like this. I had a book launch, and, and a lot of times writers, we are kind of introverted, in all honesty, and we don't like talking about our work. But then there is something that takes over when you've spent so much time, working on something. You want to celebrate it getting out there and other people reading it. And that's scary too. I mean, I will admit it's scary. It's scary to get reviews. It's scary to have people say, like, I hated this book. I don't like it. You didn't get this right. But you just put yourself out there as an artist, as a writer. You just have to put yourself out there. When the book first came out, I started working with our local library and with high schools on how to get teens interested in reading this book. Because teens, sometimes that market, I mean, there's a huge YA market out there now, but still, to get teens out and active, to a program about a book is kind of hard. So when we were talking about it, we started saying, wouldn't it be cool to bring the soundscapes in? Like, do something with the soundscapes that Fen does. And so I contacted a friend, not the friend who inspired me to do the soundscapes in the first place. That's someone on the but another sound artist. I happen to know another sound artist that was really exciting. Her name's Elizabeth Haig. And we created an evening of a reading and a soundscape to go along with the reading. So basically what Elizabeth did was, I read passages of the book, and she did, a soundtrack, basically. And she's worked on really cool things, like she was out in LA for a while. She did the she worked on Law and Order sound. She said that nobody really knows what that cha-ching is. They don't tell anybody, even the sound, like it's like secret cha-ching for Law and Order. But so that evening that we did was really well received. And so, we decided, let's try to do something more with these soundscapes and working with kids. So we applied for an NEA grant last year, and we got it. We were so excited. And so in the fall, we started working with high school students in both the Danville and Boyle County system. And we worked with about 40 kids. And each kid got a book, a free book, which is so important. I mean, it's just so important because books are expensive. Like, I hate, as a writer, sometimes I'll be at a book festival and kids will walk by and they'll look and they'll be like, how much is this book? And I'm like, the hardcovers are like $15, $18, and the kids, their faces just fall. And I hate that, but, luckily they go into paperback usually, so that's a little cheaper. So every kid got a book. Every kid read it, of the 40 kids in the 2 different school systems. That's Elizabeth working with the kids on soundscapes. So we would do workshops. I came in to talk about the book, talk about the writing process, and then Elizabeth came in and worked with them on the technology to create soundscapes. Of course, many of these kids had never heard of a soundscape. It was just, pretty remarkable. So every kid of the 40 kids created their own soundscape, and Elizabeth worked with them on the technology and how to do it. And the soundscapes could either be inspired by their own life, something that was going on, or by the book itself. And we just had a wide range of things. And by the culmination of that work over the several months was an exhibit at the Boyle County Public Library. And so all of these kids, got to see the work that they had done and got to show their families. There was a poster with their photograph and then what inspired them, and then a QR code, to listen to the sound. And honestly, it was an incredibly ing thing. Some kids got really, really personal. Some kids, just did a sound thing. So I wanted to play. I've got SoundCloud. I wanted to let you hear some of the things. I'm going to hold my. Yes, I turned this one on, right? Okay. Oh, I have to turn that one off because then I'll, Or maybe I'll hold it up. I wonder if it would work if I hold it up. Okay. Let's see. Is that? So this is one girl.
Dear Diamond, I think I made some new friends today. What if we're just being friends?
Can you hear that? It's angry. So that's one, high school kid. Let me find another. Let's see. Oh, and let me do you could go to the, so you can actually go on SoundCloud and listen to all of these. And this is Elizabeth Haig's, is that it? Main theme. Correct. So this is when I would read this story, this was her background sound. And she took in birds singing, funky music. Later she goes into a motorcycle revving. Let me play another one. This is a very personal.
Down amidst rolling hills lived Michael. Growing up in a conservative community where his family attended a traditional church and practiced homeschooling, Michael felt like he was trapped in a cage, unable to express his true self. Michael was an optimistic and determined soul, but despite this, he harbored a secret deep within himself. He was queer. Life at home was far from ideal. His mother, staunch believer.
So, these kids were really able to, express themselves in a new way. I love that. So that's an idea for, classes or whatever to really work on the soundscapes. And there was someone who talked about soundscapes, is that correct? Yeah. So, I just think it's so important. And it was an incredibly moving thing. And we're hoping to get more grants to take it around to the rest of Kentucky and do more with high school students. So now I'll go back to Pioneer Playhouse. Like I said, we'll be celebrating our 75th anniversary. My dad started it in 1950. It has been a family-run business for 75 years. My dad died in 2004. We kept it going. My sister died in 2012. We kept it going. My mother just died a few weeks ago. She was 93, and we're keeping it going. The show must go on is definitely in our DNA. And I'd love you all, to come see it. I wear many hats. I'm a writer, I'm a mom, and I run a theater. And it's a nonprofit, it's a hands-on, it's a grassroots. I do everything in the theater from, selecting the plays to finding the actors to cleaning the toilets when it's time, for the, in a theater, as I know our theater person here can say, you do everything. You roll up your sleeves and you do everything. So this year we're doing 75 years. And before COVID, we did 5 shows in 10 weeks. So we did a different play every 2 weeks. It was kind of crazy. We did that my whole life for decades. And then since COVID, we realized, we could downsize and we could do like 3 shows with 3 weeks each and not get crazy. And, my brother and I are getting a little bit older, and my mother was 93 when she passed, but she was still a huge backbone of the Pioneer Playhouse. But it's a lot easier to do 3 shows. So we do comedies and mysteries and heartwarming plays. We actually don't do Shakespeare. And that's the fun thing about being a writer, is that I could write a story about a theater like Pioneer Playhouse doing Shakespeare, because it's always what I wanted to do as a kid. But in the real world, Shakespeare scares people. Like, how many of you want to run out and see a Shakespeare play? Not that many. And sometimes we've done retelling. We did a play called Tamed that was updated version of Taming of the Shrew. But even if people get a whiff that it's Shakespeare, it's like they don't come. And as my brother says, it doesn't put butts in seats. And that's like our main thing. We're a nonprofit, but we have to make some money. And so we don't do Shakespeare. But before COVID, for 12 years, we did a Kentucky Voices series of plays where we would commission a play, 1 play a summer, that celebrated some aspect of Kentucky history. And, we didn't do kind of, I was talking about the Ephraim McDowell story, and that actually was one of our plays where we did a play about the father of the overectomy. He cut out a 20-pound tumor for a woman and she lived. But otherwise, we do kind of unusual history. We've done 1 play about Center College. That's the top, it's a football team. Center College in 1921 beat Harvard, and it's still considered one of the biggest upsets in football history. And it's from 1921. So we did a play about that. In the 70s, there were 3 women who claimed that they were abducted by aliens in Stanford, Kentucky. And it actually is one of the most documented alien abduction cases in the United States. It was in the National Enquirer. It was a huge story at the time. We did a play about that. And, something happened to those women. And nobody really knows what, and it was about the aftermath and how people thought they were crazy and they didn't believe them. So we did a play about that. We did a play about the African American experience in Danville in the 1940s. So we've done a lot of different plays. And so this summer we are doing That Book Woman, yay! That Book Woman is a picture book I wrote in 2008. It celebrates the Packhorse librarians of Eastern Kentucky. Have some of you read The Book Woman of Troublesome Creek? Yeah. Yeah. And that's right. She was here. My book came first. It was in 2008. So I was one of the first, I was surprised that not that many people had heard about the Packhorse librarians in Eastern Kentucky. So there was only 1 other nonfiction book about that. And this book, what's interesting, That Book Woman, so we're doing a play, we're adapting it. I love this picture. This is the book woman about to go into the mountains. So it was the 1930s. How many of you know about that, the Packhorse librarians? So they would go into the mountains in the 1930s and they would bring books. It was part of the WPA. It was Eleanor Roosevelt's pet project to bring books and reading to the people of Appalachia, because there were no schools really far up in the mountain. There were no libraries. Actually, library was a totally new concept in the 1930s in that part of Kentucky. So they were remarkable women, and they were all women. So it's an incredible piece of women's history and Kentucky history, and again, really strong female characters. So my book is 32 pages long. It's a picture book. I'm working with a playwright who we're developing, or making this story, we're developing more of a conflict, because, you know, in a play, there has to be a lot more conflict than a picture book. My picture book is pretty much told from the point of view of a young boy who the bookwoman keeps coming back week after week and bringing books, and he hates reading. He's proud of all he can do around the farm, but he can't read, but he's ashamed of that. So it's kind of an internal story, but we bring in a lot of conflict, like the coal company is trying to take the land, and all this stuff. So that play will be, are you giving me the? Okay. And that play will be July 2nd through the 20th. So please come. And this is what the theater looks like at night. It's a magical experience. We're outdoors, under the stars. My family is there every night greeting people. It's, you know, there are people that have been coming since 1950, since the first season. There are people that have been coming for 20 years, 30 years. And we greet them every night. We're there. We say hello. So lastly, you know, again, I've written 9 books that have been published, but I have written many, many, many more manuscripts that have never been published. My editor has rejected many manuscripts. You know, so what I tell writers, you have to have a thick skin. You have to just be able to, you know, dust it off, the criticism, maybe put that manuscript aside, go back to it later, but you have to have a really tough skin to be a writer. But when you really reach kids, that's what's amazing. These are pictures of a class in South Korea. So that Bookwoman has actually been published in China, Japan, South Korea. It's actually part of the 5th grade curriculum in South Korea. So what's amazing is this little Kentucky story has traveled all around the world. And I'm really proud of that. It's kind of, and I get letters from South Korean kids, and you know, it's really great. Recently, okay, one more thing. Recently, an old teacher got in touch with me, a writing teacher from the new school, and we had been out of touch for a really long time. And she said to me, why aren't you writing books? Why haven't you gone back to writing books for grown-ups? Because that's what I did in college. Don't you feel a little superficial writing for kids? Especially when you're not a kid yourself anymore. And I didn't think that much about it at the time. I kind of just blew it off, because she was kind of a prickly teacher back then, and so I know she liked to do little jabs. But later the question kind of bothered me. It's like, oh, why am I not writing grown-up books? But later, you know, I had a meeting with my editor in New York, and I mentioned that. And Kate once said to me, don't forget you are writing for the most important group. Because without kids coming to know and love books, where do the grown-up readers come from? So, thank you. Thank you. Questions? I'd love questions. I can walk out with my mic, right, to be kind of. Yes?
When you read, what genre or authors do you in having become an author, has your reading process changed?
Do I repeat that?
What do you like to read?
What do I like to read? You know, everybody talks about since COVID, we should be reading a lot, but for some reason our brains don't read as much. But I am really influenced by realism. I really like books that are gritty, and I'm trying to think, I always try to, Dennis Johnson, who is a short story writer from several years ago, I'm really influenced by his work. Other children's book authors like Patricia McLaughlin, if anyone knows. But what's tricky is that when you're writing something, you have to be really careful about what you read, because writers can kind of start mimicking what they're reading. So I just have to be very, very careful, you know, at the time that I'm writing, to not take a book that I might start, oh, I'm going to start kind of mimicking that. It's just natural kind of for writers to do. But I think reading is the most important thing as a writer. I think writing every day, trying to write, having a set time for me, that's what works. I write every single day at a certain time. But reading is so important. I mean, you get so inspired by what other writers are doing. I just read The Women by Christine Hanna, which, yeah, it's not, she's not typically mine because she's a little more commercial than what I usually read. But the history of women in Vietnam, serving in Vietnam with the nurses, it's amazing. So I kind of try to read things that are happening now, but I also go back, I mean, trying to think of who, you know, F. Scott Fitzgerald was, I was a huge Great Gatsby person. As a kid, I just read all the time. I can't even tell you as a teenager what I read, but I was just constantly reading. So, and I always freeze when people say, who's your favorite writer? It's like, it's hard for me to pick. More questions? And I actually read more grown-up books than children's anymore, now that I'm out of the business of editing children's books for some reason, but I don't know why. Yeah.
You explained the, like, inspiration behind the soundscapes for Fenn, but did you have any reasoning for how Mary was interested in motorcycles?
Yeah. I think, you know, I wrote a book, my first young adult was actually published 20 years ago. It was called Making the Run. And the brother in that story was really into motorcycles. And, you know, I just kind of was like, you know, it'd be so cool to have a girl, a woman interested in that. And I felt like it represented a freedom on those roads in the knobs to be able to just like take off. And I also liked the fact that she would be mechanical and kind of follow after her dad. I guess what happened is that I started thinking about Poe as someone who fixed motorcycles. And then I felt that would be, you know, something that they shared, the father and daughter shared. And then they're having this conflict, but they're both gearheads. They both kind of know this, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. So yeah, and I don't ride motorcycles, but my brother, actually I grew up on the back of, like, my brothers did motocross and dirt bikes, and it's amazing we're alive. You know, I would be like 5 years old holding on and we'd be doing, you know, this. So I do, you know, my brothers did, so I have that kind of, yeah. Yeah.
When it comes to the books that weren't published, what do you do with them? Do you have a favorite that you just kind of like keep at the top and like want to reread or re-image the story?
Yeah.
Or share out or?
I do. I mean, you know, some of them I'll put in a file, and, you know, I'll think, maybe I'll go back to this. There is a novel I worked on, like, probably 12 years ago, and my editor liked it, but she kind of felt like it was just kind of a typical teen love story. And so I put it aside, but I've really been thinking about it. So sometimes it just goes into the back burner, and then maybe I'll come back to that. And maybe I'll just abandon it. My picture book here, Lift Your Light a Little Higher, was a book that I had started writing, and it's about the Stephen Bishop, who was the best-known slave guide of Mammoth Cave. And it's a picture book about that, and it's told from his perspective. And I had written that, I did so many drafts of that, and actually the first draft was told from the perspective of the cave. Like, I thought, this is pretty amazing that Mammoth Cave has, you know, millions of years, and what has the cave seen of all the changes? And I sent it to my editor, and she was like, this is not for kids. This is like, it's beautiful, it's kind of a poem, but it's like, no. You know, and I was kind of hurt, but I went back and I kept thinking, like, whose story do I want to tell? And I finally settled on Stephen Bishop because, again, at the time, not a lot had been written about it. Frank Walker has done a book of poetry about that now. But I wanted to take that. And I actually wrote it, sent it to my editor, and she sat on it for literally, I think, 2 years. And that's sometimes what happens with an editor who's so busy, is that they sit on things and they don't get back to you. And a lot of things happen. My sister was sick, like I wasn't always pushing. But one day I went back to that and I reworked it. And then I happened to be going to speak to a bunch of librarians at Mammoth Cave about that bookwoman. And, you know, after my talk about the bookwoman, I read parts of Lift Your Light, and they were like, we need a book on this subject. We need a book on Stephen Bishop. And so I sent it to my editor with a package of information. And I said, if you don't publish this, I'm going to self-publish. I'm going to take it somewhere else. And lo and behold, like a few years later, she was like, oh, this would be a good thing to publish. You know, publishing is so fickle. You know, and it's getting more and more fickle. It's getting more, I'm a little bit jaded about what gets published now and what doesn't. But that was a book that I had put aside and then went back and reworked, and then it did eventually get published. But I do have that whole file of, no. What? What about the Imagination Library?
Wasn't that part of the kids program?
Yes, I think so.
Yeah.
Okay. I can't always remember because, you know, that's been a few years ago, and so I can't always remember. But yeah, I'm really proud of that. And another thing with my picture books, I really try to take a piece of history, like the Packhorse Librarians. My first book was called Angel Coming, and it was about the Frontier Nursing Service of Eastern Kentucky. So with my picture books, I really like to take a piece of Kentucky history that I never learned. I never learned about that stuff when I was growing up here in Kentucky. But I really want kids now to know about that kind of history. So that's what I do with that.
I got time for one more.
Yeah.
Can you tell us what you're working on next?
Yes, I am working on, what am I working on next? I'm working on another young adult. I actually finished it, and it's been with my editor for a while. She's so slow, but she's so popular. I mean, she publishes, she's the editor of Justin Reynolds and Ashley Bryan, and just some like amazing. I'm really lucky to be one of her authors. But my next book is another young adult, and it is about kids. We happen to have, someone asked me if there was a campground in Danville. Part of the theater, we actually have a campground. And what we've discovered in the last few years since COVID is that it's become a place where people come to live because they don't have anywhere else to go. And so what I've seen more and more in the past few years is that they're kids, they're teenagers that are living with their family in a trailer, in a tiny trailer, in this campground. And so my story is about kids who are dealing with homelessness, parents who are addicted, you know, a lot of, so it's, again, it's very much in the vein of Wrecked, but it's about these kids who are trying to survive in this campground. So I definitely believe in writing real things. Like that's my thing. And addiction, I don't know if anyone wanted, but you know, I know that is something that was a big part of discussions in the classes. And again, like everybody has been touched by it. I've had, you know, friends who died. I've had, you know, kids who it's just like, what the heck, and they're gone. So it's just something that we all are dealing with right now.
I had a student in class ask about if you wrote what happened in play and everything that's based on a particular incident. Sounds like it's based on a conglomerate.
Yeah, it's a conglomerate. But actually, I was in the doctor's office one day, and the nurse who comes in before the doctor comes in, you know, just happened to start telling me about how her son, like he was cooking meth and his apartment exploded. And like, she didn't know I was a writer, and it just was kind of like, wow, like, you know, and it just is everywhere, you know. And then I happened to, 4 years ago, I lost my house. My house completely burned to the ground. We lost everything. My kids and I barely made, and my husband barely made it out. It was the middle of the night. It was electric fire in an old house. And I had written the fire scene, the explosion scene before that. But it kind of like actually, once I had reread the fire scene, it was like, wow, I kind of got things right. But we barely made it out of our house. It just completely went like that. My kids almost didn't make it out. So yeah, I felt like I got it right. The fire scene, I got it right. So.
We really appreciate you all coming. We want to make sure we keep you on.
Well, thank you. Thank you all so much. I really love talking to all of you, and I love the idea that you all did presentations and things like that. So thank you. Thank you so much.